Leland Stanford was a California titan and a complex figure who became one of the most influential businessmen and politicians of the Gilded Age. Amasa Leland Stanford, railroad magnate, governor, and university founder, was born in Watervliet, New York on March 9, 1824. He came from a farming family of modest means. He had an imposing physical presence and a determined demeanor. Stanford's early years were marked by ambition and a restless drive for success. He attended local schools in Albany County and later studied law at the Cazenovia Seminary. His legal education was largely self-directed, as was common in that era, supplemented by apprenticeship in various law offices. He was admitted to the bar in 1848 at age 24, and he established a law practice in Port Washington, Wisconsin. His education shaped his understanding of business and politics, though his later career would test those foundations in ways he could never have imagined. After several years practicing law in Wisconsin, Stanford married Jane Elizabeth Lathrop in 1850. The marriage would prove to be a partnership that lasted until his death, though it would be marked by both great wealth and profound tragedy. Jane came from a prosperous Albany family and brought social connections that would prove valuable in Stanford's rise. In 1852, disaster struck when a fire destroyed Stanford's law office and library. The loss was devastating, wiping out years of work and investment. Rather than rebuild in Wisconsin, Stanford made a fateful decision. He would go west to California where gold had been discovered just a few years earlier. He was not going to pan for gold himself but rather to sell goods to the miners, recognizing that the real money was in supplying the gold seekers rather than seeking gold himself. Stanford arrived in California in 1852 and joined his brothers who had already established themselves in the mining supply business. He settled in Michigan Bluff, a mining camp in Placer County, and opened a store selling provisions to miners. The business was successful, and Stanford proved to be a shrewd merchant. He understood the miners' needs and priced his goods accordingly. He expanded his operations, opening stores in Cold Springs and eventually in Sacramento, the growing commercial center of Northern California. By the mid-1850s, Stanford had accumulated considerable wealth from his mercantile operations. He had succeeded where many 49ers had failed, not by finding gold but by selling to those who sought it. Stanford's business success gave him the financial foundation to enter politics. He became involved in the Republican Party, which was newly formed in the 1850s around opposition to the expansion of slavery. California, though a free state, had a complex political landscape with strong Democratic Party dominance. Stanford's Republican politics were initially a liability in state politics, but the party was growing in strength. In 1857, Stanford was nominated as the Republican candidate for state treasurer but was defeated. The loss did not discourage him. He continued to build his political network and his business empire simultaneously. The late 1850s brought Stanford into contact with the men who would become his partners in the greatest business venture of the 19th century. He met Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, fellow merchants and Republicans who shared his vision of California's potential. These four men, who would later be known as the Big Four, began discussing the possibility of building a transcontinental railroad. The idea was audacious. A railroad spanning the continent would connect California to the eastern states, transforming commerce and settlement patterns. It would also make its builders extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. The driving force behind the Transcontinental Railroad idea was Theodore Judah, a brilliant engineer who had surveyed possible routes through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Judah needed financial backing, and he found it in Stanford and his associates. In 1861, the Central Pacific Railroad Company was incorporated with Stanford as president, Huntington as vice president, Hopkins as treasurer, and Crocker as construction supervisor. Each man brought different skills to the enterprise. Stanford provided political connections and respectability. Huntington managed finances and procurement. Hopkins kept the books. Crocker oversaw the actual construction. Together, they formed a formidable team. The timing of the railroad venture coincided with Stanford's entry into major political office. In 1861, with the Democratic Party split over the Civil War, Stanford was elected governor of California as a Republican. He was inaugurated in January 1862, becoming the state's 8th governor. His election was significant not just for his personal ambitions but for the Republican Party's establishment in California. Stanford's governorship would last only 2 years, but those years were crucial for both California and for his railroad enterprise. As governor during the Civil War, Stanford worked to keep California loyal to the Union. There were Confederate sympathizers in the state, and there were fears that California might remain neutral or even side with the South. Stanford's firm unionism helped ensure that California's gold and resources supported the Union cause. He also used his position to advance the interests of the Central Pacific Railroad. The Pacific Railroad Act, passed by Congress in 1862, authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad and provided federal support in the form of land grants and government bonds. Stanford's position as governor of California gave him influence in securing favorable terms for the Central Pacific. The company was designated to build eastward from Sacramento, while the Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha. The two lines would meet somewhere in between, though the exact location was left undetermined. This created a race, as each company would be compensated based on miles of track laid. Construction of the Central Pacific began in Sacramento on January 8, 1863, with Stanford turning the first shovel of earth in a ceremonial groundbreaking. The actual construction proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The route required crossing the Sierra Nevada, one of the most formidable mountain ranges in North America. The engineering challenges were immense. Tunnels had to be blasted through solid granite. Roadbeds had to be carved into sheer cliff faces. Winters brought snow measured in feet, sometimes burying work camps entirely. The physical obstacles were matched by financial and labor challenges. The Central Pacific struggled to find workers willing to endure the brutal conditions. The solution came in the form of Chinese immigrant labor. Charles Crocker, overseeing construction, initially resisted hiring Chinese workers, but labor shortages forced experimentation. The Chinese workers proved to be extraordinarily capable, performing dangerous work with skill and determination. Eventually, the workforce was predominantly Chinese, with thousands of immigrants laboring in the mountains. They worked with hand tools, black powder, and later nitroglycerine to blast through the Sierra granite. The human cost was terrible. Hundreds of workers died in accidents, explosions, and avalanches. The Chinese workers were paid less than white workers and faced discrimination and dangerous assignments, yet they persevered, building one of the engineering marvels of the age. Stanford's role in the railroad construction was primarily political and financial rather than operational. He lobbied in Washington for favorable legislation and additional subsidies. He negotiated with California officials for rights of way and local support. He helped secure the massive capital needed to keep construction moving forward. The Big Four invested their own money, but they also used creative and sometimes questionable financial arrangements to fund the project. They established construction companies that contracted with the railroad at inflated prices, allowing them to profit from both sides of the transaction. These practices, while legal at the time, would later be criticized as corrupt. After his term as governor ended in 1863, Stanford devoted himself fully to the railroad enterprise. The work continued through the mid-1860s with agonizing slowness. The Sierra crossing took years to complete. Summit Tunnel, the highest and longest of the mountain tunnels, required 15 months of continuous work. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, drilling and blasting through solid rock. When the Sierra was finally conquered, construction accelerated across the Nevada desert. The Central Pacific crews laid track at an increasing pace, racing against the Union Pacific crews coming from the east. The competition between the two railroads became intense. Each company wanted to build as many miles as possible to maximize their land grants and subsidies. The Union Pacific, building across the relatively flat Great Plains, initially had the advantage. But as they approached the Rocky Mountains, their progress slowed. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific, having conquered the Sierra, was laying track rapidly across Nevada and into Utah. The two lines approached each other in the spring of 1869. The meeting point was finally designated as Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads were joined in a ceremony that symbolized the unification of the continent. Stanford represented the Central Pacific at the ceremony. He was given the honor of driving the final spike, a golden spike specially made for the occasion. In one of history's memorable moments, Stanford swung the hammer and missed the spike entirely. The telegraph operator, who was supposed to send the signal done when the spike was driven, sent it anyway, and celebrations erupted across the nation. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The journey that had taken months by wagon could now be made in days by train. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad made Stanford and his partners extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. They controlled transportation across the West. They owned vast tracts of land granted by the government. They influenced politics at every level. The Big Four became known as the Railroad Barons, and their power was both celebrated and resented. The Central Pacific, later reorganized as the Southern Pacific, dominated California's economy and politics for decades. The company set freight rates that could make or break businesses. It influenced elections through campaign contributions and controlled newspapers. The railroad's power became so great that California's legislature was sometimes called the Railroad Legislature because so many members were beholden to Southern Pacific interests. Stanford's business practices and political influence made him many enemies. Farmers resented the railroad's high freight rates. Competing businesses complained about monopolistic practices. Reformers attacked the corruption and political manipulation. The railroad's treatment of Chinese workers, who had been essential to construction but were then discarded and discriminated against, was particularly controversial. Stanford himself supported Chinese exclusion laws, despite the debt the railroad owed to Chinese labor. This hypocrisy was typical of the era's business leaders but no less troubling for being common. Despite the controversies, Stanford's wealth and power continued to grow through the 1870s and 1880s. He invested in other businesses, including wine production. He established extensive vineyards near Sacramento and became one of California's largest wine producers. He bred horses at his Palo Alto stock farm, developing a famous stable of trotters and thoroughbreds. His horse farms were among the most advanced in the world, using new techniques and technologies. Stanford was fascinated by animal locomotion and funded Edward Muybridge's pioneering photographic studies of horses in motion, work that contributed to the development of motion pictures. In 1885, tragedy struck the Stanford family. Their only child, Leland Stanford Jr., died of typhoid fever while the family was traveling in Italy. The boy was 15 years old, the center of his parents' world and the heir to the Stanford fortune. His death devastated Leland and Jane Stanford. In their grief, they decided to create a memorial that would benefit other young people. According to family legend, Stanford told his wife, "The children of California shall be our children." They decided to found a university in their son's memory. The Leland Stanford Junior University was established in 1885 on Stanford's Palo Alto stock farm. The university was to be non-sectarian, co-educational, and practical in its curriculum, focusing on preparing students for useful lives. Stanford endowed the university with his fortune, including the land, buildings, and an initial endowment. The university opened in 1891 with 559 students and a distinguished faculty recruited from across the country. Stanford served as president of the board of trustees and was deeply involved in the university's early development. The founding of Stanford University was perhaps Stanford's greatest legacy, transforming his wealth into an institution that would educate generations and become one of the world's leading universities. In 1885, Stanford was elected to the United States Senate, representing California. He served in the Senate until his death, though his service was not particularly distinguished. He focused on railroad interests and California concerns but was not a major legislative figure. His Senate career was marked by the same mixture of self-interest and public service that characterized his business career. He supported legislation favorable to railroads while also advocating for California's development. His wealth and political connections made him influential, but he was never considered a great senator. Stanford's later years were marked by increasing legal and financial troubles. The Southern Pacific Railroad faced numerous lawsuits over land grants, rates, and business practices. the federal government sued to recover loans made to the Central Pacific during construction. Stanford's personal finances became entangled with the railroad's finances in ways that were difficult to untangle. His relationship with his former partners, particularly Collis Huntington, deteriorated into bitter feuds over money and control of the railroad empire they had built together. Despite these troubles, Stanford continued to focus on his university. He attended the opening ceremonies in 1891 and remained actively involved in its governance. The university was his redemption, his way of transforming the wealth gained through ruthless business practices into something beneficial for society. He saw it as a living memorial to his son and a contribution to California's future. The university's motto, Die Luft der Freiheit weht, the wind of freedom blows, reflected Stanford's belief in practical education and individual opportunity, even if his own business practices had often limited opportunity for others. On June 21, 1893, Leland Stanford died at his home in Palo Alto, California. He was 69 years old. The cause of death was reported as heart failure. Stanford's death came at a time when his finances were in disarray and legal battles were ongoing. His funeral was attended by thousands, including business leaders, politicians, and university faculty and students. He was buried in the Stanford family mausoleum on the university campus, alongside his son. In death, as in life, Stanford was a figure of contradictions, remembered as both a builder and a robber baron. Stanford's estate was valued at approximately $30 million, an enormous fortune for the time. However, much of it was tied up in railroad holdings and real estate, and the estate faced numerous creditor claims. Jane Stanford fought for years to preserve the university endowment from creditors. She succeeded, ensuring that her husband's educational legacy would survive. The university nearly closed during the financial crisis of the 1890s, but Jane's determination and careful management saved it. She served as the university's benefactor and de facto leader until her own death in 1905. Stanford's legacy is complex and controversial. He was one of the builders of modern California and the American West. The Transcontinental Railroad that he helped create transformed the nation, enabling settlement, commerce, and communication on a scale previously impossible. It united the country physically in ways that would have lasting political and economic consequences. The railroad brought prosperity to California and opened the West to development. Yet this development came at tremendous human and environmental cost. Native American lands were seized. Chinese workers were exploited and then excluded. Competitors were crushed. Political systems were corrupted. The wealth of the railroad barons was built on government subsidies, questionable financial practices, and monopolistic control. Modern historians have judged Stanford harshly for his business practices while acknowledging his contributions. He was a product of the Gilded Age, an era when business ethics were minimal and government regulation was weak. He operated within the legal and ethical standards of his time, which permitted practices that would be considered corrupt today. He was not unusually unethical by the standards of his fellow railroad barons and industrialists. Yet this does not excuse the harm caused by his business practices or the inequality his wealth represented. Stanford University stands as his most enduring legacy. The institution has educated hundreds of thousands of students and has been at the forefront of research and innovation for over a century. Silicon Valley grew up around Stanford, and the university played a crucial role in the development of the technology industry. The university's success has vindicated Stanford's vision of practical, innovative education. Yet the university itself has grappled with the contradictions of its founding, acknowledging that its endowment came from exploitative business practices while celebrating its founder's vision. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Leland Stanford is that he was a man of his time, ambitious and capable, who built great things through methods that enriched himself at others' expense. He was neither a hero nor a villain but rather a complex figure who embodied both the achievements and the inequities of America's Gilded Age. His name graces one of the world's great universities, but it is also associated with corporate power and political corruption. He helped build the West while exploiting those who did the actual building. He created lasting institutions while engaging in practices that undermined democratic governance. In the end, Leland Stanford was a titan of American capitalism who accumulated vast wealth and power through the Transcontinental Railroad, used that power to dominate California's economy and politics, and ultimately sought redemption through philanthropy. His legacy includes both the railroad that united the continent and the university that bears his name. He is remembered today primarily for Stanford University, which is perhaps appropriate, as it represents his attempt to use his wealth for public benefit. Yet any complete assessment must acknowledge both his achievements and the human cost of those achievements, the exploitation and corruption that enabled his success, and the complex moral legacy of a man who was both builder and robber baron.